Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Politics of Guilt and Shame breakout session. During Dr. Jordan Peterson's rise to fame in 2016, he famously said that free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning. And of course, guilting and shaming in public discourse is the attempt to break down that mechanism, to try to arbitrarily reinvent our functioning society by force, and not for the better. We see feminism's male chastity crusade and the hashtag #MeToo madness. We see the left's shaming tactics to denigrate Trump supporters. We see the use of guilt to manipulate debate on Indigenous issues. We see trans activists trying to shame politically conservative transgender people into believing that being conservative means that you hate trans kids. Guilting and shaming to try to break down our free society is not okay. So with no further ado, our first speaker is men's advocate Bettina Arndt. Our second speaker is writer and commentator Daisy Cousens. And our third speaker is academic Dr. Anthony Dillon. I'm Libby Downunder. I'm a writer in the alternative media scene in Australia. I'm trans and I'm proud to be conservative. And today I'll be your chair for this breakout session. Rolling your questions into Hoover, and it's now over to you, Tina. Thank you.
Thank you. The notion that #MeToo was some sort of big breakthrough in the women's path to liberation is total hogwash. It's been clear to me for a long time that it's simply the latest salvo in a long crusade by feminists to crush male sexuality. It's been a really long campaign. I was fascinated to discover that the 19th century suffragettes had a slogan, "Votes for women, chastity for men." And that was all about bringing an end to women's sexual subjugation to men, which meant reining in male lust and keeping all men on a very tight leash. If they could see us now, the suffragettes would be celebrating in the streets. They've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Men today are not just chaste, they've been neutered. Leaving sex to the feminists is like letting your dog vacation at the taxidermist, said Camille Paglia. And that's right, men are now totally stuffed. And the feminists have achieved this through the politics of guilt and shaming, very public shaming. Fear of that shaming pulls all men into line for fear that they too will end up with a target on their heads. That's the reason we have men in power selling out other men. Malcolm Turnbull's up there imposing bonking rules on cabinet. Newspaper editors destroying men's lives, publishing unproven MeToo allegations. You don't have to look hard to track these. Guys, you can come and sit down the front, there's room here. You don't have to look hard to find evidence of these successive waves of feminism attacking male sexuality. In the second wave feminists in the 1970s, Kate Miller's book, Sexual Politics, which was known as the Bible of women's liberation, denounced raunchy male novelists like Henry Miller and Norman Mailer, slamming their depictions of sex as all about misogynist subordination of women. We then saw wave after wave of denouncing men for their sexual habits. Men were endlessly in trouble over sex, in trouble for not keeping their trousers zipped, for groping and harassing women, for looking at pornography or gazing at women in the wrong way. A few years ago there was this fascinating book called The Testosterone Files, written by a young feminist writer who has a sex change, becomes a male, and I might just hang on. So she becomes a male, and she's sort of blown away by the urgency of her desires, his desires. You know, looking at the covers of girly magazines and the newsagents. But what was fascinating, he said, he watched the female audiences in talk shows wagging their fingers at sheepish male guests who are publicly shamed for being porn addicts or womanizers. And he's shocked by women's ready assumption of moral superiority. Do you remember that Macquarie Street banker a while ago there's some sort of cross. Spokesperson for the bank is doing a report on finance, and he was caught in the background looking at a computer which had a sort of half-naked celebrity on the cover. And he was shamed around the world for enjoying looking at a woman's body. Or there was another old guy sitting next to Princess Mary at some official function, and she's got major cleavage, and he's caught having a good look. She sees him looking and quickly adjusts her cleavage and gives him a very disapproving look. And he too was caught on video and shown everywhere and denounced as a dirty old man. Now just think about that. Like all women, she has the right to dress how she likes, to flaunt her sexual power over men, but woe betide any male who's caught looking, particularly if he's old or ugly or not in her target market. And that's what's happening everywhere. We've got this tiny group of feminist extremists who've convinced us this is a totally reasonable way for women to behave. I recently took part in an SBS documentary which is based around a survey which found 19% of Australians call themselves feminists. And of course that's absolutely being swollen by the large number of young women graduating from humanities courses in our universities, which are totally captured by ideology. 65% of men and women feel sexism has gone too far. We've still got some seats down here, people. So we've essentially got this tiny group controlling our society. Look what happened when the women started flooding into traditional male workplaces. Encouraged by the feminist movement, they started imposing new rules about male behaviour. Even in car factories or army barracks, you weren't allowed to put up sexy calendars anymore. They started imposing rules about sexy jokes or banter, even though there are plenty of women who enjoy that sort of talk. I mean, that's been the amazing thing for me. This tiny group, deviant group of women is deciding how men and women should behave everywhere. And of course, post-Me Too, we've got men's lives being ruined, men even killing themselves, because 20 years ago they propositioned a woman in the workplace, even though the workplace is the place where a lot of people actually start new relationships. But you can now, of course, be hung, drawn and quartered for making a proposition, even asking someone out, which is deemed as inappropriate in a workplace. So we've got this constant demonising, constant defining male sexuality as deviant. And I think the real point is that most sensible men and women enjoy the erotic spark. It's one of the things we like about being in a workplace where there are men and women working alongside each other, is banter, flirtatious male and female interaction. But we've all been silenced into expressing our views about this sort of issue. You remember when Chris, the West Indies cricketer, Chris Gale, jokingly asked out a television reporter who was interviewing him. And I think most people thought the outrage in response to that was just ludicrous. There were all these examples emerged of female sports people, coming on to commentators, coming on to other people on television, and they never got into trouble. I mean, it was just incredible. And the poor guy was fined $10,000 by his cricket club because sports administrators were busily virtue signalling their way out of trouble. Or more recently, there was AFL managers who were forced to resign when it was discovered they were having affairs, which had nothing whatsoever to do with their job. So all the kowtowing by men in power is driven by the politics of guilt and shame. And what worries me is there's growing numbers of women who are going off sex in long-term relationships, and they are very much part of this protest, if you like, against male sexuality, because there are a lot of women who just aren't interested in sex, and they're easily conscripted by the feminists to do their work for them. I've been getting growing alarm about the numbers of women who are going off sex in long-term relationships. I've been following this for many years. A few years ago I did a book about it, And you find that across the Western world, the gap between men and women in terms of sexual desire is increasing. Huge numbers of heterosexual married men are living lives of sexual deprivation, having sex doled out to them occasionally, like meaty bites to a dog, as one man said, or having sex not at all. My favourite was the man who said he got so sick of initiating sex that he finally said to his wife, "That's it, next time we have sex, you're going to initiate." That was 8 years ago, and they haven't had sex since. So what's interesting to me is you've got this big group of women who aren't very interested in sex, and they're easily conscripted by the feminists to come on board various campaigns they're running against male sexuality. And so even if you talk about the fact that that sex between, that there is some sort of sexual obligation in a marriage, that it's just not reasonable for men to live their lives dealing with constant sexual rejection, you get howled down. If you Google my name, you'll find one of the favourite slogans for me is that I'm a rape cheerleader. And that's all over the Twitter sphere. And I was once speaking at the ANU about all of this, and they, of course, had protests outside the university saying it was violence against women to suggest there was any obligation to even talk about looking after each other's sexual needs. So we have lots and lots of women living happily celibate lives, and men are having to just cop it sweet. Can I give you that? So amazingly to me, we're having across the world a move to criminalise customers of prostitutes. They've got laws now in place in many European countries, Canada and so on. A man having an affair knows that could mean the end of their marriage and the loss of their families. And what we particularly see now is endless talk about porn addiction. That men are liable to become sex addicts if they look at too much pornography. Back in the 80s, there was this lunatic, a real Fruit Loop called Andrea Dworkin, ferocious anti-porn campaigner, trying to shut down the sex shops and video shops. She saw intercourse as consorting with the enemy, as Dachau brought into the bedroom and celebrated. But so it started decades and decades ago, this real campaign against pornography, and that's just simply seems to be increasing every year. And yet we've had really good research actually in Australia showing that most men have seen pornography, many use it regularly. There's no good evidence that it's turning them into addicts, that they have difficulty controlling their use. I did research into this a few years ago and found lots of men use it to keep a lid on their sexual frustrations, particularly when they're not getting much sex in their marriages. But any man who looks at porn knows that the risk is if they're caught using it, they'll be shamed. And it's seen by their partners as some sort of betrayal, like having an affair. Just think about how differently we reacted when we had this crazy book, 50 Shades of Grey, which became the all-time best-selling book. All the commentators were out in force saying, "Oh, this is mummy's porn, how wonderfully liberating for women to be able to read about sexuality in this way." And of course, even though the book is full of S&M, pretty tricky sort of stuff from a feminist point of view, that was fine because women know how to differentiate between fantasy and reality. But of course, daddy's porn is something totally different. Men don't know how to differentiate between fantasy and reality, and the real risk is that it's going to turn men off normal sex if they get involved with pornography. The big difference, of course, has always been men tend to like visual sexual material and women are more interested in words and plots and so on. The famous South American writer Isabel Allende talks about the difference between erotica and pornography. Erotica is like using a feather, pornography the whole chicken. And men have always enjoyed the whole chicken. And there's always been chickens around. There's always been types of visual pornography, visual and sexual material that men have enjoyed. I once knew a man who used to say, decades ago, he said, he used to lie in wait for the Sunday paper to be delivered so he could leap on it and see whether there were any Kmart catalogues with women in underwear. But so the shaming continues, and the battle against pornography is only just part of that. But it's not just, of course, about sex. I talked on Friday about what's happening in our universities. The universities investigating, the committees that have been set up investigating sexual assault on campuses, the fake rape crisis on our campuses, the sexual consent courses. But there are other issues that are just as important. I've been involved in the last few weeks in a campaign to help a young man in Perth who's a counsellor, who was a counsellor with Relationships Australia in West Australia. And he's just been pushed out of his job for posting an article I wrote, and I published nearly 2 years ago in the Weekend Australian, on domestic violence. What I'd done is I spent months and months pulling together all the research and all the recent statistics on domestic violence, which of course shows that at least a third of the victims of violence, domestic violence, are male, and there's over 40 years of research showing that most family violence is two-way violence involving violent women as well as men. And he put my article up on his private Facebook page and was involved in a bit of a discussion about that, saying that, and the other counsellors were saying they see violent women as well as violent men. And he was forced out of his job. We've started a crowdfunder to support him. So if you'd like to go on my website, you'll see that. Maybe some of you could contribute to this guy who's taking the Relationships Australia to the Fair Work Commission over unfair dismissal. But so we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, he's out of a job. So there are constant lies being told about a whole range of issues, including domestic violence, and everywhere people are being shamed out of not calling them out, these lies, for fear of being branded as a misogynist who doesn't want to protect battered women. It's a really difficult issue to confront this publicly. So we have our Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, boasting of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on domestic violence and saying it's all about respect for women. Do you remember that? I'm sure you've all seen that ghastly ad where the little boy, slams the door in a girl's face and it's all about respect for women. That's a total lie. There is no good evidence that in Western countries like Australia that it's anything to do with misogynist attitudes to women. There's a whole range of research showing what domestic violence is all about, and that's the least important factor in our sort of country. David Leyonhjelm has been busily asking questions in Senate estimates, grilling the bureaucrats who started that, who were involved in that TV campaign, saying where's the evidence for this, and of course they can't come up with anything. Police in Brisbane a few months ago were required to take part in a White Ribbon Day. You know about White Ribbon? White Ribbon is this organisation which is conscripting men to stand up against violence for women, which is laudable in a way, except for this organisation absolutely refuses to acknowledge that any male's a victim of violence. And these police were being asked to make pledges, say, I stand up against violence against women. And some of them refuse to do that because they say we go into homes and we see violent women attacking their partners and their children. So they stood up and made a pledge saying, I support violence against everybody, and White Ribbon refused to use those pledges. We need to stand up against this, and it's really important we take people on. We need to take on the shamers and the guilt mongers. So, any older women here? I always appeal to mothers of sons. We have to worry about the young generation of men. But any of you who have men in your lives you care about, you need to stand up and be counted, because we are the majority. This group who's controlling our society is very much a minority group that could easily be shouted down if we were prepared to stand up against them. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. There was a time, once, long, long ago, when people didn't really talk about politics. Nobody felt obliged to publicly state their political or ideological leanings, and the idea of voting as a secret ballot was honoured and expected. As the saying went, the 3 topics to avoid at dinner were money, religion, and especially politics. After all, in a world back then without the means of instant communication that we have now, why would you waste a catch-up with old friends discussing something so dry? If the subject of politics was actually broached, very few people took it personally or cut off connections or sought to ridicule those who just happened to have a different political opinion. Nowadays, we can all attest to the fact that it is a very different story. Given the way that the cultural cards have fallen over the last 30 or so years, touting a certain political view, namely, dare I say it, a right-wing point of view, can be, for lack of a better word, dangerous. The left's march through cultural institutions such as academia, the entertainment industry, and of course the media, has created a social landscape that is a landmine for anyone who aligns with conservative or libertarian values. Talk to any university student who has ever dared to voice an opinion contrary to the left-wing green dogma spouted by the ex-hippies dominating the ranks of faculties nowadays, and they will have a story of fending off a barrage of personal attacks from their tutors and their peers, or even failing subjects for not falling into line. Ask a conservative who works in media, the tech industry, or the arts, and they will inform you in no uncertain terms that they keep their views to themselves for fear of not only losing their friends, but their jobs. Social media, which is dominated by millennials who are churned out of universities like left-wing drones, has made it all too easy to form online lynch mobs to attack those who just happen to fall outside of the popular cultural mainstream. This is augmented by the easy access to information online, namely opinion dressed up as fact, which creates echo chambers where, in left-wing circles, a doctrine of acceptable opinion is bounced around. Anybody who infiltrates this space with an opinion that even slightly deviates from the norm will find themselves ruthlessly attacked in the most vicious and personal way possible, especially if those taboo views are expressed by women, racial minorities, or anyone in the LGBT community. They will be severely punished for not sticking to the identity politics plantation and eventually ostracized for their troubles. Now, these attacks would be fine if they were countering the arguments that the left's ideological opponents were making, but this seldom occurs. As Ben Shapiro likes to say, the left's only argument is character assassination. Oh, thank you. Oh, no, I liked it the other way. When a right-winger puts a leftist in the corner, which, let's face it, is most of the time, cries of bigot, racist, homophobe, misogynist, bimbo whore who has capitulated to the patriarchy and dresses like a 1950s housewife, in my case, abound, along with attempts to discredit their opposition, rather than actually address the issues raised, because the left's goal is ultimately to shame and intimidate their right-wing opposition into silence. Now, this shaming and guilting of conservatives and libertarians has become part and parcel of existing within the Western cultural bubble, and the lack of resistance from the right over the years simply to keep the peace has allowed the left to march on, bumping around in their echo chambers, certain of their own correctness, and more to the point, never being called out or reprimanded for their bullying and bad behaviour. Whilst this cultural standard of shame and guilt has been rooted in political discourse for some time now, it has never been more evident than over the last 3 years, during the campaign and eventual election of a man who is many things and goes by many names, like Daddy, Uncle Donny, the God Emperor, Uncle Daddy God Emperor, the King of Twitter, the greatest internet shitlord of our times, the eternal peacemaker as of late, the world authority in four-dimensional chess and a man who could quite possibly be the second coming, President Donald J. Trump. Now, the election of Donald Trump is arguably the biggest media and cultural faux pas in human history. It's true. It was the great reckoning of the cultural left, not just in the USA, but around the world. However, it certainly did not look like that to start off with. The minute that Trump was announced as the nominee, it became very, very clear that the global left-wing establishment had a very specific agenda. Sure, the predominantly left-wing media gave Hillary Clinton some tokenistic critique about her emails or something, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the slander and lies they threw around not just about Donald Trump, but about his supporters. Look, make no mistake about it, the media is actually predominantly left-wing. This is not a conservative conspiracy theory. You are not imagining things. No matter how the left shrieks, "Rupert Murdoch!" about the press, the numbers speak for themselves. According to a survey by the University of Indiana, as of 2013, only 7% of journalists in the USA identified as Republicans. This is largely to do, of course, with location, as media jobs tend to cluster around the Democrat-dominated coasts. And thanks to an analysis by a data reporter called Tucker Doherty of Politico, we can see that by 2016, 51% of publishing employees worked in counties that Hillary Clinton won by 30 points or more. That's opposed to just 11% working in counties where Trump won by the equivalent points. So it's no surprise then that of the 59 major publications that endorsed either Trump or Hillary, only 2 of them, 2 out of 59, went the way of Trump. Similar is true of the Australian media. According to a 2012 study by the University of the Sunshine Coast, 51% of journalists describe themselves as left-wing, as opposed to just 12% identifying as conservative. Narrow it down a bit, and you will find that, fun fact, at the ABC, our publicly funded broadcaster with a prerequisite for impartiality, 41.2% of the 34 ABC journalists surveyed who declared a voting intention said they would vote for the Greens. The Greens. Followed by 32.4% for Labour, and bringing up the rear, 14.7% of the coalition, for the coalition. So considering these numbers, you cannot tell me that the global media were not engaging in a sort of search and destroy mission when it came to Donald Trump and those who supported him. The narrative that the media and the rest of the academic left were determined to see through was to have the first black president, followed by the first female president, regardless of the unsuitability, shall we say, of the female candidate in question. And they were willing to go to any lengths to do this. Now, it is one thing for a media organization to hurl insults and tell blatant lies about a political candidate. Politicians know what they're in for and they can generally take it. But it is quite another for the media to make an industry out of insulting, ridiculing, and lying about a whole subsection of the population just because they happen to support the wrong guy. Now, my memory of the early depictions of Trump supporters by the media was angry, white, fat, gun-toting racist men from unspecified swampland America, missing their front teeth, who wanted immigrants caged and sent to live in an island somewhere out in the Pacific. I also remember the press depicting them as a tiny minority of the US population who should simply be laughed at for thinking their candidate could possibly beat the loving, tolerant, educated, feminist queen of the Democrats. And as for the idea of Trump women, well, they didn't even seem to exist. The first look the general public really got at the women who supported Donald Trump was after the infamous pussy-grabbing comments. These women were depicted as either sloppy hillbillies who knew nothing other than what their husbands told them, or big-breasted whores in white t-shirts who supported Trump for no other reason than they wanted the hot, popular, misogynistic, racist white jocks to sleep with them. Does anyone else remember that? I vividly remember that. That was the only picture we got of them. However, at least America was given another perspective by Donald Trump himself. His rallies were legendary and his online presence an enterprise of genius. He was, after all, a TV star and knew exactly how to win the affection of the public. Unlike the left-wing establishment, he didn't ridicule his voters. While Hillary Clinton was calling those in Middle America a basket of deplorables, Trump was praising them for their hard work, family values, and traditional way of life. He used the shame and the guilt spewed by the media to create a sort of underdog culture, acknowledging the mockery directed at his supporters by the press and assuring them that this was not, in fact, the truth. But in Australia, we didn't get that perspective. All we had was a heavily left-leaning press who were regurgitating just everything that it heard on CNN, and the few conservative journalists who were actually brave enough to voice their support for Donald Trump were either ignored, dismissed, or viciously attacked. According to the Australian media bubble, to be a Trump supporter was to be a racist, homophobic, bigoted, sexist, and above all, evil person who deserved to be demonized and ostracized from polite society. There was no option to admit even to yourself that, hey, you know, this Trump guy, he's saying some good stuff about immigration and jobs, and, you know, I agree with him on political correctness, so yeah, maybe America should give him a shot. No, absolutely not. If you said that out loud and said it to the wrong people, you would be at best screamed at, or worst, possibly punched in the face. As such, there was a great sense of guilt associated with even considering that Donald Trump could be a better candidate to lead the world than Hillary Clinton. To even think that was to commit a gross moral transgression that you should be ashamed of. Even I was originally on that bandwagon, and I love Donald Trump right now, back when I had no knowledge really of American politics or of the culture war. The left-wing media and cultural figures had cultivated an environment where Trump supporters were inherently and automatically associated with immorality and violence. Given the strength, magnitude, and prolific nature of this message, it's no wonder I resisted the pull of the Donald for so long. It took an unusually curious mind to wade through the Australian media hysteria about Trump, especially as a woman, when he was being painted as the greatest misogynist since Bill Cosby. Or another Bill with the same initials. Fortunately, after some late-night Fox News sessions, along with some serious YouTubing, I got past the heaving finger-pointing of the press and recognized that while Donald Trump, yes, might have his flaws somewhere, he was highly intelligent, had an awful lot of merit, and was planning on doing some really great things. Plus, he is hysterically funny and shitposts like a champion. Still, I couldn't admit this publicly, and neither could many others in my situation. If I had, my majority of regressive left-leaning friends at the time would have shrieked hysterically and dropped me from their circles like a hot potato. Needless to say, they don't like me very much anymore. But then, Trump won. Leftist elites, not just in the USA but around the world, were left sitting in their big city metropolitan ivory towers at universities, tech companies, school boardrooms, Hollywood movie sets, theatre dressing rooms, and most notably, media organizations, crying into their iced lattes and wondering where on earth it could have all gone so horribly wrong. They had been forced to consider, for the first time in decades, that maybe, just maybe, not everyone agreed with them. They were faced with the fact that perhaps given, for example, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump and 42% of women overall, that identity politics was perhaps not the sole defining factor in how a woman, or how anyone else for that matter, thinks or behaves. Media organisations were scraping egg off their faces for predicting landslide wins from the Democrats. HuffPost even released a poll the night before the election, giving Hillary a 98.1% chance of winning. Which will never not be funny. And as for Trump supporters around the world, not just those in America, but people generally who are sick of identity politics, political correctness, sloppy policies on immigration, and being told they were fools for voicing opinions that deviated from those of the good people at BuzzFeed, well, we were given some goddamn vindication and walked away with the knowledge that once and for all we should never, ever, ever feel guilty or ashamed of voicing a conservative or libertarian opinion, because at the end of the day, we are on the winning team. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, welcome. Before I start, let me say what a fantastic conference, and credit to the organisers for just pulling off something this grand and excellent. We take it for granted that this just runs like clockwork, but there's a lot happening behind the scenes. So I want to go on the record as saying a big thank you to the organisers. And thank you very much for coming to this session. The use of guilt to silence the debate on Indigenous issues. Now, what am I going to talk about too? Look, I've been slotted into the Indigenous box, and everything I say here applies to a whole lot of things. So, you know, if Indigenous issues is not your thing, just apply it to something else. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Indigenous issues in this presentation. There's one here, what the heart can't accept. Very favourite expression of mine. Okay. I want you to think for a moment, how would you respond, or how do others want you to respond when the following is said to you? And I think you've probably all heard these before, and you may have even used them yourself. Who's guilty of using them? Who's had it used on them before? Okay. What's meant to happen, or what's expected? So the person who's firing those bullets at you, what are they hoping for?
Shut up.
You'll shut up, you'll back down, or you'll even apologise. Yeah. That's what they're hoping for. And a very basic law in psychology, behaviour rewarded is behaviour reinforced. So if you do shut up, if you do back down, if you do apologise, that's a reward for them, and they will continue to use those tactics. So just very quickly, when someone says, you know, I'm offended, or you've offended me, you haven't offended them. They've simply learnt to use offence as a weapon to shut you up. More about that shortly. If we have a look at the dynamics of relationships, a relationship where the context is, say, friendship, you have that dynamic there, friend, friend. Okay, pretty straightforward. However, if the dynamic changes to where guilt is introduced, say, you know, with customers, another one. So let me just go back to these ones, sorry. So I mean, they're just examples, okay, but when you introduce guilt, suddenly it's a multi-layered thing. No longer are you just the mother or the parent or the customer or whatever. You're the guilty. Okay, and if you're guilty, there's someone you've offended. So you have an offender and offended. There's someone who claims to be violated. You've violated me. And you're suddenly the violator. Or suddenly someone is oppressed and you're the oppressor. You know, and as soon as that language starts, it means shut up. Okay? Or in the case of what I'm supposed to be talking about today, just a this bit. Okay. You suddenly have this, you're a racist, okay? And you're meant to feel guilty. No one wants to be labelled a racist. It sticks to you like glue. Okay? So the dynamics, so we can be good buddies. As soon as guilt is thrown in, that buddy relationship, that buddy status changes. You know, I suddenly become the abuser, the offender, and you become the innocent victim. And as we agreed upon earlier on, all those sorts of things are meant to shut you up, silence you. Okay. People will avoid hearing anything that is a threat to their sense of self-worth. They will stick their head in the sand, denial, quite a common one. Use threats to silence others, and that's great. If you're big and strong, you can do that. Or if you're the boss or the head of a family or whatever, you can do that as well. But what if you're weak? You don't have those sorts of things. How can you silence someone? You use guilt to silence them. Okay? A very powerful weapon of the weak people is to use guilt. And there is great power in adopting the role of victim, okay, which seems counterintuitive. We'd think the victim is the weak one. But I should just clarify too, when I talk about victims, because I get criticised for this, especially in Aboriginal affairs, there are what I call legitimate victims, and Jacinta Warren spoke about that yesterday. Okay, so those Indigenous people who do not know where their next meal is coming from, do not have a roof over their head, are waiting to be abused by that elder, that woman who's going to get her teeth knocked out because she has no money to give the husband to go buy some more booze. Those Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people who live in a condition that an environment we wouldn't let our dogs live in. Okay? They're legitimate victims. Then we have the counterfeit victims or the fabricated victims. There is great power in being in that position. You get to silence others, you get to stifle debate, and you can even sometimes get a payout for it. It can be quite profitable. And that rule I said just a few minutes ago, which is again one of the most powerful and overlooked in psychology, behaviour rewarded is behaviour reinforced. And to use a very simple example, which I often use, I think I used it last year, these things start in childhood. So you've got a little kid with the mother in the shopping centre, the little kid wants a lolly, and mum says no. The little kid throws a tantrum, the mother gives in. What has that little kid learnt? The next time they want a lolly, throw a tantrum, okay? The better way to deal with it is what I did with my girl. She'd scream and cry. I said, darling, is that the loudest you can cry? Cry really loud for me, honey. I want everyone to hear. She gave it up. She didn't get the lolly. The behaviour was not rewarded. So some guilt tactics used in Aboriginal affairs. The G word, the G spot. It is a source of pleasure for them. Okay? I think sometimes impromptu jokes are the funniest. 200 years of genocide, and it's really difficult to enter a debate in 2018 on Aboriginal affairs without having the genocide word thrown in your face. Okay? These people need to read up on Rwanda and other places to see what it is. Transgenerational trauma. Well, we don't quite know what it means, but it sounds impressive, and you're not going to argue with it. Okay? I do, but it can mean anything you want to. But for the victims, they like to say, we have no choice. We are suffering because this happened to our parents and their parents. And as those who attended the talk yesterday, where was the transgenerational trauma in Warren and Jacinta? Okay. It skipped a generation, it would seem. White splain, white privilege, white supremacy. Okay, just by being white, you are guilty. okay? Which means shut up. Okay? You're white, shut up. Colonisation. Now, just a quick little detour here. And when I sort of give a presentation like this, or I'm using this in a debate, I'm accused of forgetting the past, or I'm trying to cover up the past. No, I'm not trying to cover up the past. All I'm trying to say is, let's not forget the past, just don't tie yourself to the past, okay? We are never, ever victims of the past, but only ever victims of our view of the past. So I think they're the biggies. That one there. Just very quickly, an acknowledgement of country, welcome to country. That's fine if it's done in a genuine, sincere way, but when it's used to beat the white person over the head and they're reminded about their genocide and the sins of their father, it's an attempt to make you guilty, the audience guilty, and by default, them innocent. So guilt is used against others by the guilty again and again because it works. In the short term, okay? It will shut people up. It is a convenient weapon for the weak. Temporarily helps one avoid seeing what they can't afford to see. So coming back to Einstein's quote, the ears won't hear or the eyes won't see what the heart cannot accept. And what are some of those things that they can't accept? For example, again, I sound like a broken record here, but for me in Indigenous affairs, the big issues are violence, child abuse, poverty, homelessness. Now, when you look at violence and child abuse, that is definitely something that the victim brigade, the Indigenous victim brigade, do not want to talk about. So they will shut you up. Helps alleviate one's own sense of guilt. Okay, so when I won't do it now, but other times when I've done presentations like this, when I have a big audience, usually with people, say over 25, I'll explain why in a minute, I ask them, I say, can you just put up your hand for me if you've done something in your life that you feel very guilty about, you felt really guilty about, and 99% of hands go up. Okay, and the reason why I only do this for people over 25 is because if you're under 25, you haven't had a chance to screw up your life yet. After you've lived a while, you will have made some big mistakes. 99% of hands go up. And then I ask, put up your hand if you still feel today that you're just a bit uncomfortable, it's still niggling away at you, that thing you may have done many years ago. Again, 98% of hands go up. There's always a couple of saints in the room, but 98% of hands go up. So most people, carry some guilt or the fallout from that guilt. And one of the ways of dealing with that guilt is to try and make someone else feel guilty. Okay? If you're at school and you got caught smoking, it's not so bad if others got caught smoking as well. So if you're with some other guilty people. When others are guilty, it just helps us deal with our guilt a little better. Basically lets me off the hook. Okay? So if I'm the victim and you've caused it, I'm no longer responsible. I can't say I failed. I can just say, well, you caused me to fail. Okay, it's much better that it's much better for the student to say, the lecturer had it in for me, rather than, well, I didn't prepare enough for that exam. Okay, by making the other person guilty, you let off the hook. Okay. So how do we manage these? And again, this is applicable not just to Indigenous affairs, although I have a bit of a focus here. How do you manage this when you're put in the guilt seat, when you're made to feel guilty? Follow your conscience, okay? If you have acted wrong, if you have said something out of line, and you apologise. If that's what you really want to do, apologise. But if you feel that what you've done is right or was right at the time, stick to your guns. So listen to your conscience, not their conscience. Respect their right to see things. Respect their right to see things differently to you. So they're entitled to have a different opinion. And this is usually the one I often use. You can make yourself as upset or as offended as you want. And I emphasise to the person, you're making yourself offended. I'm not causing the offence. You make yourself offended. Never justify your rights. As soon as you justify your rights, they are no longer your rights. Rights don't need to be justified. It's one thing to give information to someone. Why are you late? Oh, the bus was late. You know, that you're just giving information. But if you, oh, well, okay, this is what happened. As soon as you're having to justify yourself, you've just reinforced the notion of guilt in the dynamic there. So be sure of what your rights are, stick to them, don't justify them, because as soon as you justify them, you lose them. Don't play the us-them game, so particularly in Aboriginal affairs, don't see it as you're a white person voicing your opinion to a black person, but rather you're just an Australian having a conversation with another Australian. And a good mate of mine was telling me he does not care, it does not worry him that there are several thousand Indigenous kids in Australia who are abused and going to bed hungry. He said what does worry him is that there are several thousand Australian kids going to bed hungry and being abused. So do away with the us-them mentality and just look at it's just us. That's pretty much my presentation. Guilt, don't fall into the trap. Follow your conscience and let other people deal with their guilt. Thank you.
Thank you to the speakers in this panel. Very insightful. Great insights they've provided. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for submitting questions to the panel. So our first question, directed at Tina, do you see a link between the God's police of the Victorian era and the modern women's movement?
I think I probably answered that. I mean, obviously there is a link between, there is a link between the assumptions. The Victoria, I mean, that's what's interesting in a sense about where we are now and where feminists is joining us, is the fact that they're pushing women back into a sort of victim role that needs protecting. And it's the most peculiar thing. I don't know how many of you have seen Camille Parlier talking about what's happening in universities and saying how she fought for the freedom to be raped. She fought for the freedom for women to be treated as adults, to take risks, to live in colleges with men, to have their own autonomy. And now all of a sudden it's all coming back, this idea we have to be protected, and we all blush if we're told a dirty joke in our presence, and and that is the most extraordinary turnabout. That feminism is pushing women back into being victims, and it's really offensive to old-fashioned feminists like me. Not that I'm a feminist anymore, but I used to be.
Okay, the next question for the panel. Do you think that the extreme lurch to the left of major centre-left political parties and the adoption of identity politics is driving minorities, particularly gay men, to the right side of politics? So from what I've seen thus far in the transgender community, the answer is that, from what I can see, it's a further lurch to the left. There is some anecdotal evidence that some members of the trans community are lurching to the right, but they're certainly keeping quiet about it. And I guess the main reason, from what I can see, why it's easier to keep a bit more quiet about it, if you decide to lurch to the right, which I have in the past 1 or 2 years, the accusations can get very extreme, such as, even though I'm trans myself, apparently I'm a transphobe, I'm transphobic, I hate trans kids, I think people shouldn't, transgender people shouldn't transition, and that I'm selfish and only I can transition. And so the wild accusations come out, and often trans people find that their main source of support is the trans community. So I couldn't speak on behalf on other minority groups unless our panel have anything further to add.
No, just the Indigenous one parallels what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
You're in denial, you're a coconut, you're a sellout.
Mm-hmm.
I think with women, I notice as well, sort of on the older end of the millennial spectrum, so sort of Generation Y, a lot of them are really just getting sick of what Bettina was talking about. We need to be protected and we need to be coddled. and they're no longer identifying with this far left lurch, but they don't quite know where they sit because the idea of being right wing has been so demonized. And the saying goes, the right think the left is naive, the left thinks the right is evil, which I think is quite an accurate summation, but no one's actually given them a viable alternative. So I think the important thing to do is to actually give these young women a viable alternative, because at the moment they're kind of stuck in limbo.
Okay, so the next question is, what can women and men do to raise awareness about sexual assault and harassment without demonising each other and fighting a common cause, which is equality and equity?
It's interesting because obviously they're in the sexual harassment arena. There is obviously a real issue there. The Harvey Weinstein issue case started off with proper investigation showing this man has behaved in really abhorrent ways, misusing his sexual power and so on. So, and we all know that there are other examples like that of men misusing their sexual power. I think what's really difficult is to sift out that sort of offensive behaviour from everything now being thrown into that same basket, from women claim. And there's a Canadian member of Parliament who said she was traumatised for 6 months because she was in a photograph with 2 other parliamentarians, and one of the men there made a joke about this wasn't the sort of threesome he didn't envisage, you know. This is really sick behaviour, and no one called her out saying, what, and how could she possibly present herself as a rational person with that point of view? And I think it's extremely difficult for people to speak rationally about what is genuine harassment in this current climate, because everything, all these trivial behaviours are being brought in.
And I'll just add to that, I remember after the Me Too thing came out, Matt Damon, if anyone remembers, made some comments that I thought were very sensible and agreed with. He said, look, at the end, this is horrible, but at the end of the day, there is a spectrum of behaviour. You can't lump a catcall in with, you know, the rape of a 12-year-old girl. And I think most people would agree with that. I mean, people like Minnie Driver and you know, the people who pushed that movie went off their brains and shamed him and said, how can you say that you're a man? Can't men just be quiet for once in this situation? And he had to apologise and lie low for a while. And I just think, you know, how are we what Bettina's saying, how are we supposed to actually sift through to find the genuinely bad behaviour when everything is lumped into the one category for the sake of 1, semantics, and 2, to silence men?
Okay, next question. Could you please elaborate on the definition of a feminist? I've been led to believe it is the equality of genders. I think that the misandrist agenda is commonly confused with that of a feminist. What are your thoughts?
Do you want to go, or shall I?
I mean, when I became a feminist, it was about equality. It was about a level playing field. It was about giving women opportunities that had been denied them. And boy, has the ground shifted. Because to me, it's now about demonising men. It's about giving women unfair advantages over men. Tilting the laws to favour female victims at the expense of the men who are being accused. And it has moved from something that I was happy to support to something I think is really abhorrent and extremely dangerous in our society.
I used to call myself a feminist as well until a few years ago, because to me feminism was really about libertarianism, so women having the freedom to do, say, and think whatever they want, needed to have control over their money and their social lives. But then when words like mansplaining came to the foreground, I thought, this is a bit weird. And to me, feminism, rather than being associated with the true definition, which I think is freedom and equality, has become about victimhood, obviously, and also absolving women of responsibility for anything that's wrong with their lives, which is incredibly dangerous. because you just deny women the chance to self-improve and to have incentive and to fight for what they want. If you tell them, no matter how hard you try, your gender's always going to hold you back, well, where does that leave women? You know, I know you listen to this sort of, I've heard girls say, oh, I can't get a date because I don't fit the conventional standards of beauty and the patriarchy's mean and horrible, and that's why it's like, no, you can't get a date because you're a jerk. You're an unbearable person to be around, and I only hang out with you because I have to. So, you know, where does that leave women?
Again, just paralleling what Daisy said, if Aboriginal people are told, look, the reason why life expectancy is down, you're in poverty, etc., is because of the white racist government, why would you ever bother trying to get a job or improve yourself? You just wouldn't. So that sort of rhetoric just sort of zaps you of any sort of motivation or incentive to make a better life for yourself.
Okay, next question. Do you think the sex drought is contributing to male suicide?
Rarely, I think. Look, I mean, what amazes me is how men struggle on, even though they're missing. It's not just sex. It's that many of these relationships end up with no physical intimacy whatsoever. The women don't want to encourage anything that could lead on to sex, so the man gets no cuddles, no affection. It can become a very sterile relationship. So I think they're pretty rare that actually kill themselves. But what staggers me is they'll stay there for 20 years in their marriages. And mainly, of course, because they're well aware of the costs of leaving a marriage and losing their children. We've set up a really difficult situation for men in unhappy marriages because they know how much they've got to lose. And when they do leave, and then that's when they kill themselves, because the armoury is brought out that can just destroy a man's life. If a woman is left by a man and is angry at him, boy, are we giving her enormous amount of opportunities to do everything to destroy him. And that's the big link to suicide. And that's what our suicide prevention people are determined not to acknowledge. We have 5 men killing themselves every day, and a lot of that is linked to what's happening in the family court system, false AVOs, the whole family court system that is really making it very difficult for men to survive marital separation.
Okay, next question for the panel. How do you typically respond to people who tell you that you can't understand an issue or don't have a right to an opinion on an issue because of your sex, skin colour, sexuality, etc.? My personal short answer to that is it's the obvious one: freedom of speech. Period.
Yeah, look, similar response. Respect their right to believe that, if they want. But I would also add to, and you know, look, I agree, everyone should, like, when it just comes to Aboriginal issues, I always state Aboriginal affairs is everyone's business. But what I'm saying applies to other things. I would just add something which other people may not have thought of, and that is sometimes it is wise just to pick your battles at the time. Okay, it doesn't mean you're backing down. You're saying, look, nothing's going to be achieved while you're in that state, so I'm not going to bother responding. And you know, I think it might be best to save your argument for someone else who's sitting on the fence, or you know, is listening. So again, I'm not suggesting you back down. You just make a decision. Is it really worth your energy and time for that particular occasion?
I tend to agree with Anthony on this. I mean, I've been in situations where someone has said that, oh, you're a white girl from the North Shore.
Well, I don't always follow my own advice.
Neither do I. But and usually I just, when someone says that to you, literally says you can't have an opinion because of your skin colour or your background, there is no hope for that person. Think if someone gets to that point where obviously, one, they're losing the argument, so they want to shut you up. Actually, you just have to go, you know what, never going to change your opinion. you're obviously a horrible person. I'm going to save my energy for someone, as Anthony says, who is on the fence. Now, it's a good opportunity for a joke there. You can say something like, I don't care if you're the Pope with one leg. I'll say what I want, but move on in that situation.
Well, I'm more inclined to think now we have to try to talk to people. I mean, in that situation I mentioned where I was at the ANU with the demonstrators there, I went in and said, I want to talk to you about why you're here. I want to find out what you think I'm saying that's going to be offensive to you. I mean, I think we have to try to engage people, even people who are screaming at us, in the arguments and in what assumptions they're making and why they're out there screaming, and try to point out the fallacies of their arguments. Otherwise, we can't just, So I'm essentially saying we've got to get involved in debate instead of being silenced by them. We have to take them on.
With that issue too, I find often, someone, a white, again, just to use the Aboriginal one as an example, a white person will say something which I think is very sensible and logical, and they'll be screamed down, something like, says the white person. And I'll jump in and I'll say, well, actually this black fella tends to agree with them as well. And then you are even worse than the white person. So with those idiots, you can't convince them. Again, coming back to Einstein's quote, the ears will not hear, the heart can accept.
I'll very quickly add to this. I had an example of that the other day on Twitter, actually, that involved me, a crazy troller, and Jacinta Price, who we all know and love. And I was never reply to trolls on Twitter, but sometimes I do. And there was this hashtag trending that was hashtag whiteness told me, and it was so dumb. And so I had to have a crack at it. And and one guy said, "Would you say that to an Indigenous person?" And I said, "Well, I would, but Jacinta Price can probably explain it better than me because she's an expert and she's Indigenous." And Jacinta got back and said, "I don't identify as a person of colour. I'm just a person. We're all individuals." And this guy said to her something like, "I'm not in the habit of summoning Indigenous people to do my bidding, and I can understand that you have acquiesced to Daisy's opinion." And someone else commented and said, "Wow, okay, that's the most racist thing I've seen on this site all day." And I said, I agree, and a lot of that kind of stuff, especially from white people who are so patronising to people of colour who have the same opinions as white people, is they're actually profoundly racist beneath it, profoundly racist. And Rita Panahin, journalist, calls it the bigotry of low expectations, and it is the worst kind of racism, because it's, oh, the poor little minority, we're white people and we have to save you. But it's true. But I thought, that's a great example the other day of what Anthony was just talking about.
Just on that point, if the slanders and that which Jacinta, myself and Warren get regularly, they were said by a white person, they would be in jail. But it's not considered racist.
I'll conclude our final question with some very quick thoughts on my part. It's very important in my view that if one wishes to have opinions on trans issues, that they do. For the simple fact that gender dysphoria potentially has wide implications for society. Most people are men or women, and if there are people going from one gender to the other, or vice versa, from bathrooms, there's a number of societal issues that comes out of that, and I don't see, whether, it's not just the psychs, the counsellors, other healthcare professionals. It has potential society-wide implications. So on the issue, on trans issues, on gender dysphoria, if you wish to have an opinion on that, it's very important that you do. So to conclude, round of applause for our speakers today. And thank you for coming to today's breakout session. Thank you.